Out of all the major video game publishers and console manufacturers, Nintendo has always been a company filled with the most unexpected of surprises. Since its earliest ventures in developing video game software and hardware, the one-time Japanese trading card and toy company has always brought an experimental, yet still rather playful sensibility to how it designs games. Motivated by the creativity of those minds represented within the company, as well as by a need to compensate for some of its lack of means or resources. Of course, while many of these experiments in play did manage to achieve major financial success and left an indelible mark on popular culture, other experiments in the past that Nintendo has done did not fare so well in the marketplace. After the major success of its fifth home console, the Nintendo Wii, first released in 2006, the company attempted to double down on the Wii's achievements with the release of the Nintendo Wii U 6 years later. Being fully backwards compatible with the Wii and carrying the same motion control technology, only now coupled with a highly unique proprietary gamepad controller and a little bit more graphical horsepower, the Wii U was more or less an upgraded version of its predecessor, attempting to consolidate Nintendo's hold on the Wii market. Unfortunately, due to a poor marketing campaign, the rise of modern mobile phones, and of course extremely difficult hardware to develop for and port games over to faithfully, the Wii U seriously failed to meet Nintendo's high expectations, and has since remained an example of the potential flaws of Nintendo's approach to hardware development, in which the desire to create more unique hardware overrides a certain common sense reasoning. However, this does not mean that the Wii U was without its own fair share of well-received games within its limited sphere of reach. And of these more positively received software titles, perhaps the most notable was the 2015 released third-person shooter, Splatoon. A massive competitive online game with a fashionable yet kid-friendly twist, Splatoon was a game that really defied a lot of expectations. First revealed during the Electronics Entertainment Expo of 2014, the game had been in development for about 2 years, and was a first for Nintendo as far as the online shooter genre went. Not only was the game not Nintendo's usual forte, but its more colorful and less hardcore aesthetic put it in an awkward middle region where it was anyone's guess at the time whether or not it would be able to appeal to fans of either traditional Nintendo games or of competitive online multiplayer games. The story and setting of Nintendo's Splatoon takes place on a fictional future Earth where humanity has since gone extinct, leaving only the polluted remnants of our lost civilization behind as the various mutated and newly evolved creatures of the sea inherit the planet. In this mostly now peaceful world, the dominant species of shape-shifting humanoid squids, known as Inklings, regularly engage each other in turf wars, an ancient sport where said Inklings use their own natural ability to generate colored ink to cover large areas of urban territory in order to compete for prestige and prizes. While there are a variety of other species present in the game, the player his or herself takes control of their own customized Inkling in order to take part in the various games and climb their way to the top of the online ranks in order to be the freshest squid kid on the block. Upon its release, the game was praised by critics and players alike, not only for the addicting nature of its online battle modes and its highly original gameplay format, but also for the thought and care put into its visual design, as the Inklings and their fellow sea creatures are presented as having a society somewhat analogous to modern humans, but which places a strong emphasis on both fashion and music. A lot of the sci-fi fantasy world of Splatoon is greatly expanded upon in its own single-player story campaign, also known as Hero Mode, a late but welcome addition to the game during its initial development cycle. And it is the single-player campaign of Splatoon, and the two separate story campaigns of its highly successful sequel for the Nintendo Switch, to which the majority of our attention in this video will now be turned. The first question to answer before we explore each of the 3 story modes in the Splatoon series thus far is the reason why I believe it is necessary or desirous for us to do so. After all, the single-player campaigns in Splatoons 1 and 2 are more or less negligible, in the sense that they aren't exactly necessary to play at all if one just wishes to jump right into playing online with other people. So why bother getting too deep into the single player as if it were essential rather than simply peripheral to the core experience of the game? Part of the reason I decided to do this is because a huge draw for many players to Splatoon is the fantasy world which it has created. In a lot of ways, it is the attachment to this world, its characters, its aesthetic, and its lore that probably for a lot of players helps to compensate for some of the shortcomings of Splatoon's online gameplay, which, while fun and original, is not entirely perfect. And on top of that, the world and story of Splatoon, sometimes even more than the gameplay, serves for many as the reason for the continuation of their community-driven projects and interactions. Another reason for examining the story modes on their own merits also comes down to examining some of the potential of the Splatoon series from a more gameplay-focused perspective as well. When Splatoon 1 originally came out, there was a lot of speculation on where this new series Nintendo had helped create could actually go with future games and products. And no doubt it is often the case with Nintendo's intellectual properties that they do often expand beyond their initial premise and format. The best example of this being the Super Mario Bros. Series, which started out as a side-scrolling platformer and has since expanded to include everything from 3D platformers to puzzle games to even RPGs. Could Splatoon also have similar potential? Well, when it comes to that possibility, we don't have any other use of Splatoon's current style of gameplay with anything else outside of the online multiplayer modes it was originally designed for, besides the single-player campaigns. So I think by examining how single-player has evolved from Splatoon 1 through Splatoon 2 and through the Splatoon 2 Octo expansion DLC, we can get a little more insight into the more general thought processes behind the Splatoon series development, and can also make more reasonable and more tempered predictions as to what can be expected from the series as a whole, or from its single player specifically, and thus more easily determine whether the series succeeds or fails to live up to some of its perceived potential after all these years. The very first subject we will focus attention on naturally is the single-player campaign or hero mode found in the first Splatoon on the Wii U. In Splatoon 1, after creating their first Inkling and going through the standard gameplay introduction, the player arrives in Inkopolis Plaza, which acts as the hub world for the game, and soon after they are introduced to all the available game modes. If the player follows the game's nudging towards exploring one particular region of the plaza, they are instantly transported to the mist-filled Octo Valley, where they meet the less-than-all-there Captain Cuttlefish, an aging cephalopod who keeps close watch over the area. Upon their first meeting, Captain Cuttlefish explains to the player that the recent disappearance of the Great Zapfish, a giant electric eel which acts as Inkopolis' main power source, was due to the mischievous activities of the Octarians, who live deep underground and have stolen the Zapfish to power their machines, as they also plan to take revenge on their Inkling cousins. Here it should be noted that the game actually introduces this central conflict to the player upon starting the game for the first time through an Inkopolis news break, hosted by the game's central pop idol mascots, the Squid sisters. And this is something that does become a recurring gag or narrative device in the series, where the events of the single-player and the multiplayer modes are presented as occurring simultaneously within the game's fictional world in a much more immersive fashion than one is probably used to when it comes to multiplayer shooters. The idea here being that the events of the multiplayer and the single-player are supposed to be happening in real time side by side, and have the illusion of influencing each other in some way. After Captain Cuttlefish explains the terribleness of the situation, the player Squid is immediately enlisted as the third member of the new Squidbeak platoon, and is guided by the captain to their first in a long series of missions to rescue the Great Zapfish and save Inkopolis before the Octarians and their iron-fisted leader, DJ Octavio, can muster up the power to invade the surface world. Generally speaking, the Splatoon hero mode uses the same gameplay engine used in the game's online multiplayer with only a few minor adjustments. Players take control of an Inkling who can shapeshift between humanoid and squid forms and must use their primary and secondary weapons to cover surfaces with colored ink, which not only destroy enemies of the opposite ink color, but also expand their options for maneuverability, since the more ground and the more walls that are covered in one's ink, the more territory the player can then freely climb and swim in while using their squid form. Of course, not all surfaces can be painted over, and attempting to navigate through enemy-colored ink is a dangerous hazard. Also, in addition to the hostile Octarians, many of the hero mode stages feature a number of environmental obstacles such as bodies of water, various Octarian machines, as well as bottomless pits which the player must avoid and find ways around in order to progress. The Octarian enemies also come in a number of forms and classes. In most stages, the most common enemy type are basic Octo troopers, who are easily beatable foes with very little defense or offense, but who might get the better of a more ignorant player when found in larger numbers or when hiding behind a shield. Other common enemy types also include slightly more powerful twinticle Octo troopers, as well as long-range Octo snipers, flying Octocopters and Octo bombers, and various Octarian machine types such as flutters and octopods. But perhaps most formidable of all are the Octolings, the elite humanoid members of the Octarian forces who possess the same shape-shifting powers as the more homogeneous Inklings. These aren't all the enemies one encounters in their hero mode adventure, but suffice to say, the Octarians are a diverse bunch, with each enemy type having its own attack and defense patterns that requires players looking to avoid a more strenuous firefight to take a more careful approach. The Octo Valley itself is divided into 5 separate zones, each made up of 3 to 6 individual stages. But when the player enters each new zone, they are expected to find and reveal the warp kettles that lead to each of these stages by splattering them with ink. Some of these invisible warp kettles can be a bit tough to find, and you may have to climb, splat, and jump around various obstacles in the hub areas to get to them. And even though every stage is numbered, players can tackle any of them in whatever order they choose, or in whatever order they happen to discover them. This is a very simple design choice that I really like, because it kind of reminds me of old Nintendo 64 platformers, particularly stuff like Mario 64. The hub area becomes more of its own stage that can be freely explored, and which also tests how well you've practiced everything the game has been trying to teach you. The main problem with how this is implemented in Splatoon 1 though, is that there aren't really too many rewards or challenges in the hub area zones outside of just finding the warp kettles. Even if it may take you more than a few minutes in some cases to find that last kettle you missed, once you've discovered where each of the kettles are, that's pretty much it. It would have been nice to expand each of these zones to have things like minigame challenges or more environmental Easter eggs to discover. That way, if the player is having trouble finding a kettle, at least they're discovering something. The hub sectors don't have to necessarily be expanded to the open world proportions of a Banjo-Kazooie or anything, but always leaving the player wondering if there's something more to find I think would have helped make the Octo Valley feel much more like a bigger adventure or treasure hunt. Something the player wants to spend more time in. The actual stages in Hero Mode themselves are not quite as open-ended, however. For the most part, they are your usual run from point A to point B without getting killed sort of deal. In each Hero Mode stage, the player must help Agent 3 recover the mini Zapfish found at the end of the level, usually having to tackle some new environmental hazard or platforming-based challenge, or having to engage a new enemy type. Most of the normal platforming stages feel pretty distinct from one another, while combat with actual enemies can sometimes be a bit sloppy just because their AI is not very advanced, or because some of the enemy placement itself can be a little arbitrary. Fighting large numbers of basic enemies is still fun, but it's a very simple kind of pleasure. I would say that combat in the Hero Mode stages is usually at its best when you're either doing everything you can to avoid a fight, or avoiding being spotted. It's much more satisfying to sneak up on an enemy Octo Sniper completely undetected, blast them away with a splat bomb or two, and then speed on ahead. It's more fun to bide your time waiting for all of a cluster of Octo Troopers to get in a nice little row so you can take them all out in one fell swoop. And it's also fun to see just how fast you can swim past enemies while placing only the most minimal amount of ink needed for you to hurry up, get a key, unlock a squid jump pad, and race to the next section. Perhaps the weakest parts of these stages are the sections where you're stuck in an inescapable area and have to destroy X amount of enemies before you can proceed. Because there isn't any other option but to fight more head-on in those cases, and while enemy types like the Octolings are a great concept, their AI hasn't really been fine-tuned to the amount of variables that are possible when facing against an actual human player. And perhaps not having the time for such things to be playtested, their actions as a result feel too sporadic or random, and splatting them just feels like you're taking advantage of how stupid they are, or just memorizing where they're about to jump or land. I should also say that all this is probably why the weakest stages in Hero Mode tend to be stages where the player is placed in a repurposed multiplayer map, and is expected to just fight enemies. This isn't because the combat in Splatoon 1 isn't good, it's just the platforming stages use more unique level layouts, and tend to have more thought and care put into their enemy placement, while these Octoling Rush stages are using maps that have been designed around use in multiplayer, against other human beings under very specific rule sets. And this is kind of the problem with the Hero Mode generally to some extent, because it is a later development, and more or less a glorified tutorial for the new player, repurposing a lot of assets that were probably not designed from the ground up for the single-player experience. On the one hand, there is a lot of creativity and ingenuity in how assets are repurposed. For example, within the story, the whole implication is that the Octarians are highly intelligent scavengers, so in this regard, the fact that there are generally recognizable assets stitched together into maps that look and feel a bit patched up, that can lend itself both thematically and functionally. But naturally, there are some stages that can feel a bit half-assed, because the developers probably can't spare the time or resources to create new maps or new assets. and can't always take the time to review and playtest everything equally. After players rescue all the captured mini Zapfish in each zone, the time then comes for them to face off against each zone's respective Octoboss. Each of these unique end-world Octo machines requires the player to discover the strategy needed to expose and destroy the giant octopus tentacles which animate them. The 4 Octo machine bosses pretty much just follow the basic rule of 3, where the player must defeat 3 different phases that scale up in difficulty. Unfortunately, I have to say that while the presentation with these bosses is excellent, the Octo bosses in Splatoon 1 are just too easy. In fact, sometimes it feels like the battles against the Octo machines are over so quick that you have to take a couple hits or go slower than usual just to be able to see and appreciate all their animations. Given the effort that was put into each of these bosses' visual design, you'd think the developers would have at least bumped the number of phases up from 3 to something like maybe 5 or 6. Or that they would have at least increased their movement speed, shortened the time window for their exposed weak spots, or might have added smaller enemies to try to distract or impede the player. Overall, the Octo Machine bosses are rather disappointing if you aren't an 8-year-old who struggles with the game. And it's a shame too, because there were probably some very simple adjustments that could have been made to give them more of an edge. However, while the Octo Machines in Splatoon 1 don't quite live up to the hype, the crown jewel of Hero Mode, in my opinion, is definitely its final boss fight, unlocked after completing World 5. During the course of the story, our friend Captain Cuttlefish is squidnapped by his old arch-nemesis, DJ Octavio, the beat-splicin' shogun of the Octarian race. With the help of Agents 1 and 2 of the new Squidbeak Splatoon, who are revealed to not only be Cuttlefish's granddaughters, but are likewise revealed to be none other than the Squid sisters themselves in disguise, the player, as Agent 3, must face off against Octavio in what is not just a boss fight, but pretty much a whole new stage, filled with multiple respawning enemies and environmental obstacles, which have already been found in many of the previous areas of the game. The key to defeating Octavio is to send his attacks back towards him by splatting his giant metal fists and his massive projectiles, each time forcing him back further and further so that the player can navigate to the eventual end of the stage. With each phase of the fight, Octavio becomes more and more aggressive, sending out quicker attacks and summoning more basic enemies to occupy the player's time as he revs up his ultimate weapon. On top of this, each phase of Octavio has the player moving to a differently designed part of the map. One section may be free of obstacles, but will put you much closer to Octavio, thus limiting your defense game. But other sections will feature things like sponges and invisible bridges, as seen in previous stages of the game, that you have to traverse before Octavio can regain any ground. So the whole stage is really a test not only of your ability to aim or to react to enemy attacks, which are much faster than normal here, but it is also a general test of everything you've learned in Hero Mode up until this point. Even though DJ Octavio is not really too difficult now for someone like myself who is much older and now has more than a few years of Splatoon experience under his belt, he's a much more satisfying boss fight than any of the others found in Splatoon 1's single-player campaign. And that's because of this element of feeling like you're proving something to the game with each successive step. The length of the fight, which is around 3 times longer than any other boss fights, given the larger number of phases you have to fight through, still has an evenly balanced pacing. The presentation here also helps make the experience more worthwhile, as Octavio blasts his own high-energy blend of Octarian technotrance throughout the technological void of his tentacle-themed realm, but is then interrupted by the Squid sisters overriding his own radio with their signature song, Calamari Incantation. This might be a bit premature to say, given that we have yet to cover Splatoon 2 in much depth, and also given that, at least at the time of this recording, Splatoon 3 is still less than 2 weeks away from its official release, but I feel confident in saying that up until this point in time, the final boss fight of Splatoon 1 has remained at the peak of Splatoon's single-player design philosophy. It caps off not only the progression of the single-player campaign as a whole, and feels like it naturally follows suit from the more challenging stages of the game, but it also contains a sense of progression within itself that feels entirely skill-based. While it doesn't have too many super fancy cutscenes or anything, it still feels grand enough in its scale, just because of how long and intense the fight is on the player end. And while maybe the difficulty could have been upped a bit, that's more or less a criticism to be applied to Hero Mode as a whole, and not something the final boss fight can be singled out for in particular. Relative to the rest of Hero Mode as a whole, the final boss fight with DJ Octavio is a damn near perfect example of everything that Splatoon actually does right. Overall, there are good reasons why when those of us who played Splatoon single player when it first came out were able to recognize its flaws, but also had a lot of hope in what the series might be able to do as far as single player offerings went if it was given a bit more time or a bit more faith by the executive powers at Nintendo. Hero Mode demonstrated very well the potential Splatoon had, not so much as a typical action shooter, but more as a kind of platforming adventure with shooter elements. A lot of Splatoon's sense of hit detection and combat balancing in general might be criticized as being a bit too fluid, not as tight as something that may come from a big-budget, bullet-based online shooter. And even in Hero Mode, where the more unpredictable aspects of Nintendo's online infrastructure are not present, there is sometimes that sense that things are just not really as troubleshot or as play-tested as well as they could be, because this is a game clearly made by a newer team with not as much experience in the genre they're working with, and is also working with what was at the time a much more experimental and open-ended combat system. I suppose there's always been that sense with the Splatoon series, where you kind of have to be more forgiving than usual and just say to yourself, I guess it still works alright, even if maybe there's always a way to patch things up and make things more reliable or more responsive. In the case of the multiplayer, some of these shortcomings were probably forgiven on account of some of its more casual nature, and just the fact that victory was never really dependent on getting a good kill-to-death ratio at all, but rather was all about covering turf or accomplishing a more specific task that could be done even without ever having splatted another player. To be honest, this is probably something that even many fans of Splatoon forget, much to their eventual frustration, because this isn't a game where high K to D ratios necessarily guarantee effective turf coverage or an easy victory. And Splatoon really isn't that much of a combat shooter at the end of the day, even if it is wearing the skin of one, but that also happens to be what makes it stand out. With Hero Mode, as I previously mentioned, I think combat tends to be much more enjoyable when one is stealthily flanking or navigating around carefully placed units, or speedily covering turf so they can race to the end with minimal resistance. A lot of the thrill of Hero Mode comes more from its platforming challenges, I feel, of which combat is but one of several components. The main shortcoming of Hero Mode is that it's stuck playing the role of tutorial, and that it often does recycle assets and concepts in order to fill itself out. And while it does have some of the promise of being something much more open and more expansive, it never really follows through enough. The fact that the difficulty scaling seems a bit low for the most part, in possible consideration for the younger players, is also a downer. The developers clearly went through a lot of trouble designing this mode, but were almost reluctant to make it too challenging or too big, simply because this is a quote-unquote multiplayer shooter. And so I guess at the time, given the late stage of development of the Hero Mode, there was only a need to do the bare minimum in developing the campaign. This development schedule and development approach is something that I do think negatively affects Splatoon in the future, as I hope we'll eventually be able to see. The Splatoon Hero Mode levels also lack extra incentives for players to revisit them, as there's not really much in the way of scorekeeping, time challenges, or hidden items. One may feel compelled to try to grind for power eggs by replaying stages so that they can upgrade and max out their weapons, but since this isn't much of a prerequisite to have a chance at defeating Octavio, more than likely anyone doing this will be doing it after the fact, for little other reason than to satisfy a completionist impulse. There is some motivation to go back and collect each of the so-called Sunken scrolls, which are hidden in each and every adventure stage, as these scrolls offer a lot of humorous insight into the lore and the background of the Splatoon world, providing backstory to some of the game's recurring characters, as well as exploring the origins of the Inkling and Octarian societies. Some of these scrolls are very cleverly hidden, and may require going over things with a magnifying glass, figuratively speaking. Sometimes even the easier or less exciting stages take on a whole new quality when one leaves the prescribed path in order to search for the stage's respective sunken scroll. The ink-based movement system of Splatoon also gives the developers a lot of freedom to put collectibles in more out-of-the-way or precarious places, forcing players to use their squid and ink powers in a less straightforward manner. It's unfortunate that there weren't more sunken scrolls or more assorted collectibles to find in some of the Hero Mode areas, or even in the hub sectors, because the developers definitely had a talent for this kind of scavenger hunt ordeal, whether it's hiding scrolls or hiding warp kettles. But if the developers wanted to tease or show off their ability to make a squid-based collectathon shooting adventure, it doesn't seem that Hero Mode lives up well enough to the hype. The lack of further challenges or score attacks was somewhat compensated for by the inclusion of new unlockable challenges via the game's support for Nintendo's line of Amiibo figurines. But as is the case with pretty much all significant Amiibo offerings, the idea of large portions of content that are already within the game's code being locked unless the player buys a figurine that Nintendo never seems willing or able to produce enough of, is controversial to say the least. And while Splatoon's Amiibo challenges offer players new ways of tackling the hero mode stages, using alternate weapons and abilities that at times make even some of the easier levels a bit more difficult than they were before, it definitely highlights some of the problem I suggested, that certain choices which affect the overall quality of the single-player experience are made in a somewhat arbitrary fashion. The Splatoon development team clearly were able to add more content to the single-player, and went through the trouble of making more content for the single-player. But then they had to lock it behind Amiibo support, perhaps in order to satisfy their boss's demands. So if some parts of the base hero mode feel vacant, like they could have more to offer, it isn't just an issue of the development team still needing to find its bearings, and the players needing to be patient and please understand.
Please understand.
Splatoon's hero mode did a lot of things very well. The fact that it isn't just a separate mode but is within the fictional universe tied to the multiplayer in such a way that it provides a whole new in-game context to said multiplayer experience, going so far as to make your player squid the unsung hero of the game world, is a fun twist on the normal online shooter formula. And the fact is too that even if it doesn't realize its full potential, it showed that Splatoon's world, characters, and core gameplay engine do lend themselves to a range of other possibilities. And so it was easy at the time to theorize about the variety the Splatoon world could offer or would offer in the future. And as far as overall presentation, you'd be hard-pressed to find many releases from big publishers during the 2012 to 2015 fiscal years, which stand out quite as well as the original Splatoon did. Graphically, the game was never super high-end, but the aesthetic design of the game proved to be one of its most endearing features. And for our purposes, the aesthetic design of the Octo Valley areas, with their makeshift biodome look, and also the synthwave plus goth raver fashion sense of the Octarian hordes, not only looked cool, but served a specific purpose too when juxtaposed with the more pop-punk and J-rock inspired style of most of the Inklings. The game's sound design, especially the accompanying soundtrack for the hero mode stages, is almost enough of a big sunken scroll in its own right. In retrospect, Splatoon 1 feels like it might have been the most focused and the most consistent in its theming. This was likely because the game could not yet rely on highly animated cutscenes or on lots of dialogue or text dumps to build its world, but it never really needed it, to be perfectly honest. Splatoon 1, more profoundly than its successors, had to rely on more simplistic and subtle means to flesh out its world and characters. It is true that you don't really learn too much about the inner workings of Octarian society beyond what little the Sunken Scrolls tell you, but the game still found a way to endear you to these characters and turn the wheels of your imagination by giving the Octarians their own separate music, their own separate weapons, their own separate fashion sense, graffiti, etc., etc. And this was part of the deeper world-building process, which sometimes goes a longer way than any collectible document. This is not to say that some of this isn't continued in Splatoon 2. It certainly is, but it definitely starts to feel like things begin blending together a lot more as the developers' priorities shift. The second game is more willing to trade in the simpler methods of the previous game, now that it can present you with more cinematic cutscenes and such. But ironically, for all the willingness of Splatoon 2 and the Octo expansion to make use of more complex or more expensive methods of presenting their stories, at least with respect to the Octarians as characters, you don't really learn anything new or unique about Octarian society that Splatoon 1 didn't already establish. And by the end of Splatoon 2's story, the entire plot of "this surface ain't big enough for the two of us," which was originally established in the first game as something of the central pillar to the entire world's lore, is now more or less dropped, or is at least now much more trivialized. And I think this is something that isn't really appreciated well enough about Splatoon 1. Splatoon 1 is probably the only game in the series that ever treated the Octarians more seriously as the Inklings' distinct counterparts. Since the first game, it feels like the developers have not only made the lore way more complicated than it probably ever needed to be, but the Octolings appear to have been reduced to little more than just Inklings with round ears. Meanwhile, most of the other Octarians themselves have been reduced to just copy-pasted enemies that the developers like to recycle and reuse regardless of context, whenever they want mook NPCs but can't be bothered to design something new. But again, there's a certain irony here in that the only reason anyone ever cared about playing as an Octoling, or the only reason anyone ever cared about facing off against Octarians, was because of how Splatoon 1 presented them in the first place. And now it can kind of feel like most of what Splatoon 1's story mode established about them has kind of amounted to little or nothing, as the developers have decided to suddenly switch gears midway, which kind of makes certain promises feel only half fulfilled. I'm not saying that Splatoon never should have fleshed out its world or tried to add more, but with this series now trying to juggle 7 idle mascots at once, bringing in the Salmonids, inserting all this stuff about identity-destroying, world-devouring bioorganic ooze, and now bringing in so-called mammalians, and with the Octarians seeming to have even less of a consistent identity than ever, there's something to be said about the more functional and simple approach of Splatoon 1, which only needed 2 idols, a bit of flavor text, some basic environmental and sound design, and 2 identifiable types of cephalopods. One more popped out and the other more technofied, locked in a bitter but still largely kid-friendly struggle for supremacy and freshness. This was all that was necessary to capture the imagination of players both young and old, and it was able to do it all with hardly a cutscene and only 1+3 online game modes. I always do find it odd when I encounter Splatoon fans who almost seem to speak of Splatoon's story and world as if it was some big shonen anime, when the original game had hardly any animation outside of the gameplay, and was such a small-scale narrative. But I suppose that's a testament to how effective Splatoon 1 is with its rationing minimalist approach, that some fans seem to have forgotten that the spectacle they may be growing accustomed to now wasn't present in the first game. But nonetheless, it was still able to blend into one's mind, and was able to leave an equal impression that it was just as spectacular as the later, higher-end products. And I suppose on a more personal level, that's been the saddest part about replaying Splatoon 1 for me. It made me realize that perhaps much of the more playful innocence and functional simplicity, I guess you could say, which originally drew me into this series, and in a lot of ways restored my interest in modern gaming, that innocence may be gone for good as the series tries to juggle so many new concepts that it can almost never devote equal enough attention to, as it probably compounds old half-solved problems with all new ones, or as it leaves behind much of the simple yet successful approach of Splatoon 1 in an effort to try to compete with the likes of Fortnite or Ratchet & Clank, except with probably 3 times less the budget, staff, or development time. It's not that the series hasn't improved in many ways, nor is it a case of changes or growth being bad. But I will admit there are some times when I almost get more of a Splatoon 1 era vibe from something like Ninjala than I do from stuff like the Octo expansion, or from what I've seen or played so far of Splatoon 3. That could itself change, but nonetheless it's a little disheartening to have put a lot of faith, time, and effort into nurturing something that only a minority of people once believed in, only to wonder later if it may have left you behind, or may have only given you half a recompense once it matured. But I guess that's just life. I suppose there is some possibility that Splatoon 3 will do something that unexpectedly brings back a lot more of that Splatoon 1 era spirit for me, and finds a better balance, but we'll have to wait and see. But with all that said, as we move on to exploring the topic of Splatoon 2 in more depth, and how much or how little it may have lived up to the subjective or objective sense of potential Splatoon 1 veterans saw in the original game, we will see more of that trend, I think, of half-fulfilled promises and half-measured approaches. However, we might also see some more positive improvements that even I think have been slept on.